Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming all the participants for the webinar number 96 on creating podcasts for your learners, organized by English Language Teachers Association of India. First of all, I wholeheartedly welcome Dr. K N Shoba, Assistant Professor, Deputy Director, Center for Research, Anna University, Chennai, for having accepted our invitation to be the resource person for today's webinar. And I do welcome Dr. Zulaiha Shakeel, Secretary, ELTAI Tutoring Chapter, for going to be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin this session, let me give a couple of instructions. Audience can raise their questions in chat box, and the certificates will be provided to all the ELTAI members, students, and foreign professionals who are attending this webinar. Let us watch the promo video of ELTAI. Hello, I'm Dr. S. Shankarakumar, Secretary of Coimbatore ELTAI Chapter, going to be the host for today's webinar. I'm so happy to introduce the moderator of today's webinar, Dr. B. Zulaiha Shakeel, former Vice Principal and Head, Department of English, TBAK College, Kerala. She has 16 years of teaching experience, completed several e-teacher programs sponsored by Relo. She has received a Moral Emissary Award from World Humanitarian Drive, UK, and right now she is the Secretary of the Tuticorin chapter of ELTAI. Now I do welcome Dr. Zulaiha Shakeel to take over the session.
Thank you, Dr. Shankara Kumar, for introducing me. Happy to be a part of ELTAI and moderating today's session. We have with us today Dr. Shoba, Assistant Professor of English and Deputy Director, Center for Research, Anna University, Chennai, to speak on the topic, Creating Podcasts for Your Learners. She had been a top student and got gold medal in her MA in Education and completed her PhD as a Junior Research Fellow at the University of Madras. Her areas of interest are English language teaching, content development and materials design, teacher research and teacher education, educational technology, and literature and environment. She is the editor of the Journal of English as an International Language, University of Western Cape, South Africa, recipient of English Language Teacher Research Partnership Award in the year 2013 from the British Council. She had done several online certification courses like Professional Development for Teacher Trainers from Arizona State University, TESOL Core Certificate Program on Teaching and Assessing of Research through Expert Research Connect British Council, served as resource person for over 50 seminars and webinars, published 12 research articles in Scopus Indexed Web of Science and UG Journal. She's guiding 4 PhD and 8 ML scholars. Her current project is with the Electronic Skill Sector Council of India, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, for designing textbooks for CBSE. It's our proud privilege to have such an eminent scholar with us today with rich academic experience to share her knowledge on creating podcasts for your learners. Over to you, Dr. Shoba.
Thank you, Dr. Zulaiha, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm very thankful to ELTAI for giving me this opportunity to be one of the resource persons on this webinar, on the 96th webinar. So it is such an honor to be part of this group. And today, I will be sharing some of my experiences in creating podcasts, in using podcasts as a learning resource, especially in the ELT classroom, and how it can be a very resourceful, authentic resource for the classroom itself. So I have prepared a very short presentation. So let me share the screen. I hope all of you are able to see the screen. So here you can see this particular webinar is going to focus on creating podcasts for your learners. So this will be the plan for today's session. So first we will explore what are podcasts, because today it has become a very common word. Nevertheless, sometimes when we say podcasts, there are still people asking podcasts. So what are they? Can you please explain, whether it is students or teachers? So we will just have a very brief introduction of what are these podcasts. And then we will see how podcasts as resources, how podcasts can be used as resources in the classroom. And then we will move on to catch a few glimpses of our own podcast, the ELTAI Cafe, what we have been doing so far, and how rewarding an experience it has been. So we will try and focus on that a little. And then fourth session, the fourth part of this particular session will try and focus on making podcasts itself. And then there'll be a very short and quick question and answer session. I understand that I have 45 to 50 minutes, so I will try and cover most of these areas as planned. So moving on to the first topic, which is podcasts. I'm sure that most of us have started, identifying as, listening as the new reading. As teachers of English, we have been reading a lot of materials, whether these are textbooks or student resource books or websites, journal articles, project reports, PhD reports. So we have been reading these kinds of resources, especially towards our own professional development, for teaching in the classroom, our newspaper reading. But now, due to time crunch, due to the digitization of all these things which I just mentioned, most of us are accessing these resources through a digital medium. I hope you will agree with me. Like, we read the journal papers through our laptop, or whenever we are commuting, we use our mobile phone to get access to some websites. We download some worksheets, we design or tweak some worksheets using our own digital gadget. So podcast is again available in the digital medium, and these are audio files. So it is used both as a noun and a verb. Now, say for example, when you look at podcast as a noun, it is nothing but a digital audio file which is available on the internet. And you can either download it into the computer or a mobile, or you can also just listen to it. So this is available as a series, and there'll be new installments which is added, which will be available to the subscribers automatically. So this is the noun form of the word podcast. And the verb, if you say, I do podcasting, I am a podcaster, or do you podcast? So it is also used as a verb these days, like Google. Can you Google and find this? Do you use Google often as a noun? Or so making a digital audio file which is available as a podcast. So it is used both as a noun and a verb. So basically, it is a digital audio file. Now, it is a collection or a series of digital audio files which is available in the internet. It is called an episode. Every individual audio recording is called an episode, and usually they select a topic, or there will be a theme into which all these podcasts are embedded, and these are called as a podcast episode. So we will try and say, okay, so this episode is focusing on, we usually don't say this podcast is focusing on. So this podcast will focus on a common theme, but then every episode will try and highlight one particular theme within the broader theme. So podcasts can be created by an individual or a group of individuals. So they can lead a conversation. Two people can sit and talk. It is more like a webinar which is available on the YouTube. Now imagine this entire video recording of our webinar is available as an audio file for people to listen. Then you can also say it's available as a podcast. So you can share stories, or it can also be about reporting the news. Now, say, for example, most of us love reading the editorials in the newspapers. So all these newspapers, if you go into the podcast forum, they have their own podcast, like whether it is, the Hindu or the Times of India or the Guardian. So all these newspapers, they have their own podcast series where there are a lot of editorials or news items, very short news items are also made available to which we can listen. So most of us these days have the habit of, when we go on a walk or when we commute over a long distance, we are always plugged. You can see those earbuds, ear pods, which are always there into their, they are listening something. People are always listening to something without wasting their time when they are commuting. Earlier, we used to carry a book to read. So these days, everything. Some people carry a tab or an iPad through which they can read, which can be a strain on the eyes for some people. So listening is much more easier. So podcasts are hosted by individual or an individuals, or a group of individuals, like I told you. And the creator of a podcast is known as a podcaster. So if you ask me, why are you so excited about podcasts? They are just simply audio files. So, what is so great about podcasts? If you ask me, they are very authentic. Authentic in the sense now, like I told you, all these newspapers, for example, they are creating these audio editorials for people to listen to and get the news, to understand the analysis. So they can serve as authentic resources, and then they are diverse. If you ask me, what are the topics under which podcasts are available? Anything under the sky. So there are a lot of podcasts on, say, for example, yoga or meditation, science, or business, entrepreneurship. So almost every other topic has been explored. So a diverse range of topics. If you are going to teach a bunch of students who are focusing on BA history, for example, then you can try and use historical podcasts in your class. If you're teaching BSc physics students, in the general English paper, or if you're teaching computer science students, you will be able to identify podcasts which can be really useful for them. So it is not only the language, but content is also integrated. So you also know how we focus more on content and language integrated learning these days. So diverse topics are available, and then they are very convenient. So you don't have to print anything, or you don't have to carry a speaker or a laptop to the classroom. You can just give your students a link, probably in the WhatsApp group or via email, through which the students will be able to access that particular podcast or the audio file in their mobile phones, and they can listen to it either before the class. So in blended learning contexts, podcasts are very convenient to use, and they're also very interesting. If you look at all these podcast makers, they do a lot of research before talking about that particular topic, and certain very interesting perspectives are discussed. So whether it is all these young scientists, there is one podcast I follow which is about young women engineers, and how they share their experiences of their laboratory experiments or different kinds of ideas, whether even recipes are being discussed. So it's very interesting. Some people who are interested in dogs or pets. So there are various, like I told you, there are diverse topics, and so they are very interesting. And they also improve speaking skills of our students. So all of us agree that good listening leads to good speaking. Like we say, good readers become good writers. So listening skills, when you're improving using your podcast, your speaking skills also can automatically be improved. And I think the last point is one of the most inviting, most appealing for most of us, because whether you want to listen to a podcast or whether you want to make a podcast, there is no financial commitment at all. Okay, so it does not involve any money, and people can start making podcasts. So now, for example, if you have to subscribe to some OTT platform, you will have to think about making a monthly subscription or making a payment. But all these podcasts are just available for you free of cost once you have an internet connection. So there is no financial commitments when you want to make a podcast. There is no investment at all when you have to begin a podcast for your learners also. So like I told you, it is a conveniently accessible medium both for listeners and creators. So don't think that, maybe it is easy for us to listen to, but I want to create a podcast. Then is it very difficult for me? Now, in case you want to create a YouTube channel, so we know what are some of the things that is essential and how YouTube makers invest in a lot of equipment and software. But for podcasts, it is not like that. And then people who are interested in creating their own podcast, there are several venues for them to publish their work. There are a lot of takers in case, just like YouTube, when your podcast becomes very popular, there are advertisers who want to feature in your podcast, and it is also a revenue generating method. So if you're asking me, so how are these podcasts different from radio stations, right? You tune into the radio and you listen to a particular idea. But it is not like, we cannot choose between what we actually are looking for, when you tune into a radio or a television. And when you have to do something in the radio or television, there is so much of procedures involved, lot of regulations, lot of approvals. But then the podcast platform, it allows for self-publishing. So we can do something that we can self-publish automatically. So these are certain streaming applications which are, they automatically, they can be connected to the podcast and they will be available in these platforms. So these are all certain streaming applications, and you don't have to pay these streaming applications any money to host your podcast. So if you are asking me, okay, I'm just a beginner to podcast, I want to know how to listen to a podcast. So just understand it like an on-demand internet radio show. So what is this on-demand? Now, say, for example, you feel like listening to great speeches, okay, great English speeches. You want to listen to people like, say, for example, Winston Churchill or Barack Obama or Nehru or Gandhi, or some kind of speeches. So you can actually type, you can search for these kind of audio, and then you can start listening. That is why it is called on-demand internet radio show. And then all you have to do is install a podcast app in your mobile phone. So most of us have a lot of apps which we use for our own convenience, right? From Google Classroom to Google Meet, Zoom, and there are so many other apps that we use for food delivery, for sending goods and all that. Similarly, there are apps for podcasts which you can just install. And every time when there is a new episode, you get notified. This is also like your YouTube subscription, where you will be easily notified when there is a new episode. So this is all about podcasts. Once you start listening to some podcasts, you will get the hang of it. Now, as an English teacher, let us see how podcasts can be used as a resource in the classroom. So there are a lot of ELT podcasts. Now, say for example, when we say podcast, most of you might be thinking that, okay, this is some kind of a listening, an activity that I can use in my class. I can use it for some kind of a listening comprehension. So maybe some additional listening input I can give for my students. So you might be thinking like that. But then students can also get involved in recording and producing the podcast. So this is something that is very interesting. Now, say, for example, there are authentic podcasts, like I told you, news podcasts or podcasts on engineering topics or history topics, which are called authentic podcasts. So they did not make it for people to learn English. They are just there for their own sake, about art, about science, any other topic. Then there are teacher podcasts, like teachers coming together and sharing their views. Then there are also student podcasts. So students want to share their ideas. They create podcasts as a classroom. And then there are educator podcasts. So if you are asking me what is the difference between a teacher podcast and an educator podcast. So teacher podcast, the teacher is creating it for their own classroom. But an educator podcast is more like a teacher educator is creating the podcast for other teachers. Right? We talk about continuing professional development always. So CPD focuses on how other teachers can develop themselves. So educator podcasts are slightly different. Let me show you some examples. So these are some examples of ELT podcasts. This is just a tip of the iceberg, I should tell you, because a host of different types of podcasts are available for teachers, not only on teaching English, but on pedagogy itself. Now, if you can see this Jennifer Gonzalez particular podcast, it is the cult of pedagogy itself, how teaching happens, how learning happens, what are the psychological factors that are, that influence teaching learning. So that's a podcast that I follow. Then you also have this English speeches, which I just mentioned. So like I told you, these are not speeches that were made to teach English, but then they have been curated in such a way that you have a range of speakers, international, national. So there are a lot of Indians who have, given wonderful speeches here. So it typically ranges between 10 to 20 minutes. And we also know the TED talk. So it is similar to that. Then you also have all these, TEFL, TESOL, Authenteach, that is another interesting podcast. And then you also have ELT CPD. So this particular podcast will talk about a lot of opportunities that are available for English language teachers, what kind of research they can do, what is classroom research. So these are all certain podcasts that can be useful. Apart from this, there are also many podcasts that target English language learners, like Learn English. Okay, so improve your vocabulary. So there are several podcasts that focus, they focus on certain skills. So those are different kinds of podcasts. So these are flexible and very useful classroom resources. Podcasts can be used in a very flexible manner. So if you ask me, I use it as an in-class listening activity. So sometimes we play a podcast and then we do some kind of listening comprehension. We can also use it to create. So create a podcast as an in-class speaking activity where you are asking your students to speak, record through their mobile phone. And then you can also assign podcasts for homework. So this is another very interesting, because when English teachers are wondering what kind of homework can we give, should it be report writing or essay writing, you can also create a lot of written activities from podcasts. Then recommend podcasts as a supplemental activity. Now, say for example, we are teaching students to write a descriptive essay or a narrative essay. So when we are teaching the student to write this, we will give them a lot of inputs in grammar or pronunciation. But then we can also tell them to listen to this particular podcast where this person is describing something or narrating an experience to understand the dynamics of the language. So it can be used as a supplement, as a supplemental activity also. So in-class listening activities, if you ask me, what are some of the things that we can do? So I play a podcast, I play a particular episode of a podcast, maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then I can conduct a listening comprehension quiz. So when we conduct a listening comprehension quiz, you understand that, there will be a worksheet that is prepared already, and then there can be a discussion also based on what they have just listened. So that can also be a speaking activity inside the class. You can introduce new vocabulary. So once I did this vocabulary bingo game or a word search game. So, which words are used by this particular podcaster? Can you identify those words? So students will just highlight or, encircle those particular words. So you can introduce new vocabulary. Sometimes it can also be used as a conversation starter. So you can use it as, a kind of a warm-up activity where they are listening to certain episodes, and then you start the learning in the classroom. If you are teaching letter writing, you can ask your students to write a letter to the podcaster about your views. So you can take an interesting topic or a controversial topic or a debate where students are listening to it, a panel discussion or something, and you can write a letter. You can ask your students to write a letter, critical thinking, these kinds of higher order thinking skills can also be incorporated, where they are, instead of saying write a letter to this person or that person, where there is no context established, listening to a podcast and then writing a letter will help them to specifically focus on a particular context. And sometimes it can also be for listening for grammar or pronunciation. So pronunciation is always a big challenge to teach in the classroom in isolation, but through a podcast, we can easily teach pronunciation also, where the students are either listening to it individually or they can listen to it in the classroom. So grammar, you can say, okay, let us see what kind of grammar they are using when they are talking about a current issue. When they are discussing a historical event, what kind of grammar or a tense is being used. So these kinds of grammar or pronunciation activities can also be done in class. Okay, so like I told you, for speaking activity, if they are going to create a class podcast, it can be a kind of an audio tour of their school or their college, or they can just explain their classroom. So that can be one topic. They can explore the culture of the place. Okay, we can tell our students like, okay, whatever you speak now, if we put it on the podcast, there'll be an international audience to it. So talk about the culture. Now, most students, after they come back from their Dasara holidays or Christmas holidays, we ask them to write about how they spent their vacation or what they did in their holidays. So we can ask them to notice some particular festival or how it is done, and then they can try and speak about that. Current events. So this is always, in fashion, and it brings in a lot of discussion in the classroom. We can also ask them to conduct a kind of a debate, some topic, whether they are comfortable with their online classes or do they like coming to their physical classrooms. So we can ask them to conduct a debate with 3 on each side and just record it using a mobile phone. So guest speaker interviews, maybe they can interview someone. It can be the principal of their college, or it can be the head of their departments, or it can be an NCC coordinator, some NSS, a person who is very active in NSS, or it can be a very ordinary person whom they can identify from the local market. So they can identify a guest speaker and they can conduct an interview. So classmate biographies, like we do this introduction in the classroom where you introduce your friend, those kind of activities. Similarly, they can create a classmate biography and they can say, today I'm going to talk about Shoba, who is my classmate, and she comes from this place and she speaks this language, and they can create a classmate biography. So why these topics? Because this will make them invest their interest. They will be interested in talking about their classmates, or they will be interested in talking about someone around them. And of course, book reviews or movie reviews, they can create every week we can say, pick a movie that you watched or pick a series that you love, and you just make a review out of it for 5 to 10 minutes, or a very short audio podcast. So these are topics that students will be interested in creating. So aside for homework, now we will be teaching a particular idea. So we will try and find a podcast that is relevant to the topic, and we can provide instructions, the students how to access the podcast. So these days, if you see, most of us have WhatsApp groups with our students. So we can provide the link when we have listened to the podcast fully, and we can tell students what kind of instructions, and have students complete a particular homework activity. So we create this worksheet, which is a true or false activity, or a multiple choice, or a short answer, or it can also be a written response to the podcast or that particular topic. So you can tell them, write 5 things that you found interesting from this particular podcast. Write 3 learning that you had. Okay, 3 takeaways for you from this particular podcast. So these are all certain ideas for assigning homework to students. So I would like to share with you, what I recently did in my classroom. So I teach a class, Industrial Biotechnology at Anna University, and as you can see on the screen, it is a screen grab that I have taken from my mobile phone. So this activity we did last, the first week of this month, 7th of April. So this is a podcast that I follow, Think Fast and Talk Smart. This is coming from the Harvard Business Review. So this is a very, language-wise, I can say that this is a very comfortable class who can listen, whether it is a different accent. So I recommended this particular task as a homework, and I have also given them this instruction. So this podcast has 50 plus episodes. Each of you will listen to one and make notes. Roll number 1 will listen to the recent episode, and everyone else will follow suit. So there will be an assignment on this later in the class. You've got a week's time, so be prepared. So say, for example, I meet them Wednesdays and Thursdays of every week. So on a particular Thursday, I give them this and I tell them, you do this, you have a week's time. By the time I meet you next Wednesday, I'll tell you what to do. Okay, so students, they understand that the recent episode, the roll number 1 will listen, and so they just make sure that they're listening to different episodes. And what happened inside the class as soon as they came? So I asked them to make 5 points, which they understood from that particular episode of the podcast. So as you can see, As you can see, there are a lot of topics that have been discussed, and every student makes an entry. Every student makes a WhatsApp post where the students have listened to it. So they have typed the topic of that particular episode, and then they say what has been discussed, in this particular episode, and others will also be able to read it. So this can be a very interesting activity for the students. And when we talk about continuous assessment, when we tell students whatever you contribute to the class will be taken into account for your internal assessments, let us see how you are able to summarize a podcast which is 15 to 20 minutes into 5 points. So you can see where the students are entering their names and register numbers, and they are entering the topic of that episode, and they have done this. So this can be an activity where they are listening to something, where they are summarizing, and where they are also writing, and then they are also reading the other comments, right? And because this is about communication, it can be an extremely useful experience for the learners themselves. So that was one example activity which I showed you. There are several other activities which we have done in the classroom, using podcast as warm up, using podcast as supplemental activities and all that. Okay, so moving on to our own podcast. As all of you know, last year around November, when we had our annual conference, the South Chennai chapter of ELTAI, which is, we have a group of teachers and from various colleges. So we have been creating this ELTAI Cafe, and ELTAI Cafe is available on Spotify. So let us see what kind of topics we have discussed. Again, these are screen grabs from my mobile phone. So this is the, we have done 9 episodes so far. And as you can see, our podcast is called the ELTAI Cafe, where we have called it a podcast for the English teacher, ELTAI Chennai South. So there are all episodes which you can see. So in case you log into Spotify, if you have already not done and checked out this, you should do it. So episode 9, if you see, it is talking about should there be silence in the reading classroom? Because most of the time when we talk about reading, we say there has to be silence and students should be reading. So a very interesting take on reading. A very experienced teacher and ELT practitioner has discussed this particular episode. You should definitely listen to it to understand what are the nuances in reading, what are the types of reading, and what activities can be done. So episode 8, if you see, this is an interview where, it talks about an unusual journey of an English language learner who wants to become an English language teacher. I'm not, speaking more about it, but it's definitely a very unusual journey, which I strongly recommend you listen to. So you can see the other episodes as well, making tech work. For all of us know that technology is an integral part of teaching and learning today. So evaluating it. So you can see a conversation here. Then teenagers' take on reading today. Most of us say that the era of reading is gone and none of us read anymore. So and we have a lot of assumptions as teachers that students don't read, or teenagers, especially in this age, don't read. So we went and asked students, what do they actually think, whether they like reading or they have stopped reading altogether, or are our assumptions right or wrong? So they have given their expressions, their ideas. Then, is reading relevant today? So that is again a kind of a discussion. Episode 4 is students speak. So especially during this time, February, we opened all our colleges and students started coming in much earlier, and we were trying to see how they were responding to the physical classes, the transition from online to offline classes. So this is an interesting discussion on that. Episode 3 focuses on teaching language and teaching literature, right? That is an age-old debate. So just tune into and listen to that episode if you want to know more about it. You also have the other episodes, you're talking episode 2, if you see, this is an interview that we had with our president, Dr. Sanjay Arora, so that he speaks about ELTAI and what it stands for, what are the other activities that we have been doing. Episode 1 is teaching grammar. So this was a very candid discussion between a group of teachers and a lot of ideas: explicit grammar teaching, implicit teaching, what works in the classroom, authentic resources. So different ideas that we discussed. And then that's the ELTAI Cafe trailer for you, which talks about what this particular podcast is going to be. So as you can see, we have made 9 episodes, and we have a good, audience. People are listening, and they have been giving a lot of feedback to us. And every episode is made using just a laptop or a mobile phone by teachers. And then there is a bit of editing that we do. We do not have any specialist or professional we go to, but we have been doing it on our own. And it has been rewarding in the sense that podcasting has been a very reflective activity for the teacher also, for the teacher who is engaged in that particular episode. So this is about the ELTAI Cafe. So you can see that there is a logo, and then there is a description, which is a podcast for the English teacher. And you can see how all the episodes are lined up. So now let us move into how to do this. So I told you how we can create podcasts for our learners. Now, say, for example, I want to speak more about pronunciation to my students. What are the various ways in which they can improve their pronunciation? Or I want them to do a listening comprehension activity. But then I find whatever is available on the internet not suitable. Right? So most of us have this challenge of saying, my learners come from a rural background. My learners come from a very socially challenging background. So they cannot listen to all these speakers from other countries because the accent is too hard, or the pace is different. So this is one kind of, not a complaint, but a reality that we keep confronting whenever we do webinars, whenever there is a question and answer session. There is always a question about, your students are from the urban background, your students have access to technology, you have access to technology, your infrastructure is very different. But what happens to my rural learner? What happens to my college or classroom where there is no infrastructure, right? Now, podcast can be such a leveler when it comes to this particular challenge, because like I told you, you don't need much of a gadget, you don't need high tech. All you need is just a smartphone, and I don't think a laptop is also required. Just with a smartphone, you can make your podcast, you can broadcast, you can share, and you can make your learners also listen to it. So it's a very direct kind of a medium, a channel where you make podcasts for your own learners, and you know the strengths and weaknesses of your learners better, right? So if you see the structure of a podcast is usually between 15 to 20 minutes. I've also listened to podcasts that are 90 minutes, or if you go on Spotify, you can listen to podcasts that are 5 minutes, or they go on for, there are a lot of spiritual discourses which just go on for 2 hours or more than that. Some news series also, when there is a lot of analysis, it goes on. Recently, I listened to a podcast where Kiran Bedi was being interviewed, and the first IPS officer, a very inspiring kind of a podcast where she was talking about how daughters need to be, given opportunities in families first, and then how they shine in their society, in their responsibilities. And then after that, one recent podcast that I listened to was, our one person, Nirupama Rao from the Foreign Service, her experiences beginning from, how she was learning, preparing for the civil services exam. What were her experiences after she had traveled so many countries, diplomacy, how it operates. So these episodes are longer, right? And there are certain times when you feel like listening to longer episodes, when you want to immerse yourself into that experience and just travel with the person. But then there is usually a structure, like you can identify a unique music for yourself, like for your podcast. And then An introduction is very important, where you are giving the overall theme, you're welcoming the audience, and then you tell them these are the topics that I want to discuss today. Then you conclude and you give a kind of a closing remark where you're thanking the audience, the guest, or you also tell them a sneak peek into the next episode, like our ELTAI webinars, where you're talking about, it's that particular structure. And then there is some closing music if you want, same as the opening music. So ideal podcasting, if you see, it is 22 minutes, they say, and most of ELTAI podcasts are 15 to 30 minutes. So we have a lot of debates and discussions saying, oh, this podcast is long. Why did we make it so long? Oh, maybe we should have just stuck to the time. We have a lot of discussions after we finish the podcast. We take feedback seriously and we try and keep it in our mind when we do it the next time. So they say Tuesday is the ideal day to publish, but ELTAI Cafe is fortnightly. You get a fresh episode every fortnight, and they say weekly is the ideal frequency. If you make it once in a month, people will probably forget, and you cannot afford to do podcast every day. So there are certain steps involved. I will quickly take you through it. First one is identify your topic and your goals. So that is very important. You have to say, okay, this will be my topic, and I'm doing it because of this. I'm trying to help my learner in speaking. So I will try and identify the topic, and the goal is this. Now, once you start identifying, you have to listen to other podcasts that are already available. Like when you are writing a research paper, you identify the hypothesis, or you identify your problem or your research question, and you do a literature review. So you listen to other podcasts, and then you develop your format. You tell yourself, okay, my podcast will be 10 minutes and my podcast will be a solo podcast. Okay, and then you choose a title. Like we chose ELTAI Cafe. So, you have to choose a title. Then you write a script. I still remember when we made the first episode, especially the trailer, I wrote a script, and, we all shared, and we said, no, we have to rewrite this, we have to do this. So always preparing a script or an outline can be helpful, at least in the beginning, few weeks or months. Gather the necessary equipment. Like I told you, what equipment do you need? You just need those apps in your mobile phone, like your voice recorder, which is an inbuilt app. And if you want some audio trimmers, those apps also you can install. There are 2 other important apps which I will tell you. And prepare a space for recording. So I think post-pandemic, all of us have our silent corners, or we have the Zoom spot in the house where we think that we are ready for recording. So prepare a space for recording so that there will not be other disturbances. So record your podcast. So because you have chosen the topic, your script is ready, your mobile phone is ready, you have a quiet space, then you record just the voice. After you have recorded your voice, definitely there will be some kind of errors, where you have spoken something and then you forgot what to say. Then there was a kind of an awkward pause, or the person whom you are interviewing said something and said, no, I don't want to say that now, please edit that. So certain things can happen. So you have to just cut and paste those things using your other apps. Prepare your podcast for distribution. These are all very easy and ready-made now, so you don't have to do a lot of preparation. Upload your audio files into a podcast hosting service. I will tell you a podcast hosting service which will automatically, try and upload your podcast. Then you have to market your podcast. Of course, market means it's not like, you are going to sell your podcast to someone. You just share a link where everyone listens and, they give you comments and feedback. So 2 things, just recording and publishing. When you talk about the script, it can be an interview, it can be a monologue, it can be a narrative, or there can be multiple hosts, or it can be a mixed format of all these 4 types. And when you talk about the voice app that you need, usually the voice recorder which is there in your mobile phone or in your laptop is good enough, right? So most of the time we use video conferencing tools like MS Teams or Google Meet, because MS Teams we have that recording option. We use MS Teams, or you can use Vocaroo or Dolby On. These are all different voice apps that you can install in your mobile phone, and then you can edit it. So you have Audacity, which is kind of recommended by a lot of podcasters. Then you also have Audio Trimmer, which I use. SoundForge is one thing. So the format is usually MP4 or MP3. MP4 is your video format if you are recording the interview, and then you convert it into an MP3 format. Of course, if you want a background music, if you are very choosy about it, please select royalty-free stock music. If you just Google for it, you will get a lot of royalty-free music. But in case if you're using Anchor, which is the app for doing podcasts, you don't even have to select music. It automatically gives you a list of music, which it adds to the BGM. Okay, so like I told you, these are the two apps that I want you to keep in mind. The first one is Anchor and second one is Spotify. So both these apps you will have to install. Spotify is the hosting platform where all the podcasts are available. You can just search for the artist, or you can search for the song or for the podcast, and it has a very wide reach. Now, Anchor is the podcast maker app. So once you download Anchor, you will be logging in. There will be an email ID which is asked for, right? So usually it's a Gmail ID that we give, and the audio that we have recorded, right? So I have finally edited and my audio is ready. It is for 13 or 14 minutes. My audio is ready now. I have to upload it in the Google Drive of that particular email ID. Now, say for example, I am using my email ID. So in that case, I have to upload that audio MP3 file in my Google Drive. And when I'm downloading Anchor, I have to give the same email ID. Okay. So when I want to import the audio from a library, it will automatically take it from the Google Drive. So this is the library that I'm talking about, and this is from our ELTAI Cafe episodes when we download it. So when you open Anchor, you will be having record, library, all these options. In case you want to record it, you can do live recording, but most of the times, like, we make some mistakes and we want to edit. So the library, automatically, it is taking the episode from the Google Drive where I have uploaded it. So you can upload your final MP3 episode, that is after all the editing, from your Google Drive in Anchor using the library icon. You can add BGM by clicking the music button. So you can see there is a small music button. If you just press plus, it will ask, do you want to add music? If you say yes, it will show a list of music, stock free music, which you can just click and you can see. If you see why there are two episode 9s, the first episode 9 has this is after adding the music. Okay, then you can add a description about the episode. So how do you add a description? So you can see how I have added a description. So usually after I add the description, I share it with my colleagues. I ask them, is this okay? Do you want to modify it? So we kind of modify it. And then you can also see we have a logo like a coffee mug or something. Season 1, episode 7. So probably after 1 year is over, we will call it season 2. And episode type, this is full. And you can also publish now. If you want to publish it immediately, you can put publish now. Or if you want to change the publish date. So sometimes we do it 2 days ahead. And we say, no, I want to publish it only on this particular day. So at those times, you can say change publish date, just you're scheduling it for a different publication date. So after you choose the time and date to publish, you have to click publish. So you have to publish now, and then you check Spotify after 10 minutes, your podcast is now live. All you have to do is share your link. So this is how an MP3 file becomes a podcast. Okay, so that will be the end of the demonstration. I know it is not much of a demonstration, but then it is very easy. It is doable. You don't have to install a lot of software. You just have to check online for any audio trimmer or audio merger, all these things, and you can do it. So I hope the session was useful. I hope we saw how we have analyzed podcasts as resources. We have analyzed how whether it is a teacher podcast or whether it is for students. So before we begin the podcast, we have to think who will be our target audience and what will be the level, the difficulty level of our podcast. We will have to discuss all these things, and then who are we going to bring on our podcast? All these things we have to discuss, and then when we do it, I think our podcast is ready. So that will be the end of my session, and I'm ready now for some Q&A. I think I will stop sharing this.
Yeah, thank you for that enlightening session, Dr. Shoba. The session was lively with useful inputs that would certainly help the facilitators to enhance their classroom activities. We could see a lot of appreciation for the session on the chat box with comments. And we had in the session what is a podcast and how podcasts can help learning without straining the eyes, first of all. It improves speaking skills. Students can be motivated to learn grammar and pronunciation through podcast activities. And podcast platforms allow self-publication. That was very interesting. So she also introduced some streaming applications such as Spotify, Stitches, and so on. And Dr. Shoba introduced 4 types of ELT podcasts and the difference between a teacher podcast and educator podcast. She exemplified so nicely how to get the students to make their own podcast by an in-class activity, supplemental activity to develop their 21st century skills. Students may prepare an audio tour of a place that can even be their school or classroom. And ma'am, the classmate biography is really an interesting topic. How can we take advantage of the existing podcasts and how this can be repurposed to draw the new audience? And she also gave some tips to teachers on how they can help the students to access the podcast by sharing links and worksheets to activate learning. Thank you so much for demonstrating ELTAI Cafe from the streaming application Spotify. It was nice to see some of the episodes being recommended to use. Displayed the structure of podcasts with theme, opening, closing, music, all those things were covered, and the ideal length of the podcast, and finally how to record, publish, and market by introducing some of the podcasts apps like Anchor and Spotify. Altogether, it was a quite interesting and impressive session with the way it progressed, Dr. Shoba. Now the floor is open for discussion. We welcome the attendees to post their questions on the chat. We have got some questions already. The first question is posted by Ms. Shanmugapriya. The question is it useful only for online classes?
Not at all. Like I told you, the IBT class which I went to, where I was using this particular, think fast and speak smart, so talk smart. That particular podcast that was used in a physical classroom. Okay, because even in physical classroom, I think teachers are using a lot of technology today. We use blended learning a lot, flipped classrooms. Though we have gone to the offline mode, we use a lot of it. So this particular thing was used in the offline class only, ma'am. So not just for online, but also for offline.
Yeah, the next question is from Mr. Naila Khanam. How can we use the podcast in a language classroom? You have done with it already. Still, the participant may like to know more about it.
Okay. So like I told you, we focus on the 4 language skills, also the sub skills. So when it comes to listening, definitely podcast is a great resource for listening, because you tell the student what to listen and the student comes prepared, having listened to it or looking forward to listen to it. Speaking activity, because there is so much of input. We can work with pronunciation, we can work with vocabulary, and speaking can also be done. Reading, when we have, you saw the WhatsApp group activity which I did, where students are reading others' posts and writing. When students are summarizing, they're writing a small response based on the podcast itself. So all the 4 skills can be developed, and the sub skills like vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, once you prepare the worksheet or once we have done the planning and the homework, I think podcasts can be a very useful resource for teaching language. Yeah. Thank you, Naila Khanam, for that question.
Yeah, the third question is from Dr. Vinod K. Chopra. If a teacher creates his own audio file for students, say for pronunciation or some debate or a summary of a story, will that fall in the category of podcasts?
Definitely yes, but it can be a podcast only when it is uploaded and available for everybody to listen to. See, sometimes before I started my podcast, I will always record the reading passage or the listening passage and I will make it available to my students through a laptop using speakers. So I cannot call that a podcast. I can only call it an audio file, so which is used for listening in my classroom. But then when I upload it in a streaming application where anybody can listen to it and use it. So Dr. Vinod, whatever you kind of do upload can be useful for other teachers also. This is just like the worksheets or the YouTube videos. So if you create your own audio file and use it only for your students, it stays as an audio file, like an MP3 audio file, which I said. To make it into a podcast, you have to upload it into all these podcast hosting applications.
The next question is from Jyotsna Sood. How is it different from listening activity in ALS?
Okay, listening activity?
In ALS.
Okay. In ALS, okay, I'm not sure what she's referring to by ALS, but then lot of audio files are anyway available. When we are trying to listen to these files, you may not know what will be the next update on it. But in a podcast, you know that there will be a next episode. There will be a kind of a continuity that you are following, and also the range of the topics, range of the number of episodes, the quantity, and you also get to choose the quality. Now, say for example, I want to choose something from India only, then I will choose only from India. If I want to choose something from the US or the UK, I have the options. So, it can be a very motivating and enriching experience for the teachers also.
Let's take one final question, ma'am. Is from Mr. S. Thangam Soundrapandian. Could you please share some ideas to inculcate interest among the students to listen to such podcasts to improve their English?
Okay. So the one that I showed you, English speeches, that particular podcast when I shared with my learners, basically it all depends on what kind of activity you are creating based on that podcast. If you're simply telling your learners, you listen to this podcast and come, nobody is going to listen. Like I told you, there will be an assignment on this when you come to the classroom. And when you assign in groups or when you assign as individuals, I think then the responsibility is more and students will be motivated. And when they're doing group activities, even if 2 or 3 students are doing it very sincerely, the other students will also be motivated. And when they see how convenient and easy it is, going to a particular streaming platform, it is just like watching a YouTube video. So when they know that it is very easy, and when they get the hang of it, and they don't have to sit and watch, they can just listen to it as they are walking, as they are cycling, or as they are walking to the classroom also. So these are all the motivating factors for students. And when they make it a habit, they can also listen to a lot of content that is specific to their subject, whether it is mechanical engineering or automobile engineering. When they listen to podcasts related to that, they will see that the content also, their knowledge of their subject can also be improved. And I'm sure they'll be motivated. Later, you can ask students to identify good podcasts and recommend it to the classroom.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. With this, I submit our sincere gratitude to the speaker of today's webinar, Dr. Shoba, for her excellent deliberations. I thank the webinar organizing committee of ELTAI for their constant guidance and support to organize this webinar successfully. I thank the attendees of the webinar for sparing their valuable time to participate. Thanks a lot for your involvement and interaction. On behalf of ELTAI, I thank one and all once again. Over to the host, Dr. Shankar Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zulaiha and Dr. K N Shoba for making this wonderful evening very fruitful for all the ELT lovers. And an announcement for the next week's webinar, the webinar number 97, which is going to be held on 1st of May 2022 on the topic Supporting Learners Effectively by Dr. Meena Sridharan, a training consultant, and the session is going to be moderated by Mr. Suzai Ratnam, chapter head of Thiruvarur. I do welcome all the participants to come back for next week's webinar on this topic. And I wholeheartedly thank Dr. K N Shoba for making her wonderful presentation and sharing all your experiences about creating podcasts. And I profoundly thank Dr. Zulaiha for having moderated the session. And further, I do thank all the participants on behalf of ELTAI for their fabulous participation. And have a great evening. Thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you.